People will still be arriving, but we can kick it off now. So welcome everyone to our lunchtime seminar on definitions of child exploitation. We are the Modern Slavery and Human Rights Policy and Evidence Centre at the University of Oxford. My name is Fatherazi and I'm the Research Associate here at the PEC. So today's lunchtime seminar is a little different because this event has been organised together with the UK Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner and ECPAT UK. We are so delighted to have you both here at the seminar launching this wonderful piece of research. The project was co-commissioned between the PEC and the IASC office and carried out by ECPAT UK with legal analysis written and supported by Freshfields LLP. We're grateful to the Commissioner and to the research team for this rewarding collaboration. So I'm honoured to officially announce the launch of the report, More Than Words, How Definitions Impact on the UK's Response to Child Trafficking and Exploitation. The report covers the many different definitions of various forms of child exploitation in law and policy, as well as how those definitions are understood by practitioners and put into practice. To provide a quick snapshot for those who may not be familiar with the topic, the research found that inconsistent definitions of child exploitation are undermining the identification and protection of children who are exploited in forms such as sexual, criminal, and labour exploitation and domestic servitude. The findings of this research also explore the many components that define what constitutes as modern slavery, such as the means, movement, and coercion elements, and how competing understanding of these elements can lead to misidentification, as well as the potential consequences for a child who has experienced exploitation. So we will post a link to this report in the chat. It is a lengthy report and the summary is still longer than most summaries published by the PEC, but it is a fantastic read and wonderfully structured. So I urge you all to dedicate some time to the outputs and I promise you won't be disappointed. So in terms of today's structure, we are so pleased to have three wonderful speakers. First, the UK Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner, Eleanor Lyons, will deliver opening remarks. Then our Principal Investigator and co-author, Duran, Head of Policy, Advocacy and Research at ECPAT UK, will present the findings and takeaways. We will then have a 20-minute Q&A session before finally hearing closing reflections from Patricia Durr, CEO of ECPAT UK. A huge thank you in advance to all three speakers joining us today. We will try to keep the presentation to around 15 minutes and hope to wrap up the whole event by 1:30. Right, that's all from me. I will now hand over to Eleanor Lyons for the opening remarks.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here today. And as the UK's Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner, I work to ensure that victims of modern slavery are better identified, protected and supported, especially children who are amongst some of the most vulnerable. Every child deserves safety, dignity and justice. And as my time as Deputy Children's Commissioner before this role showed me, I know how easily children and young people can have their experiences mislabeled, misunderstood or missed entirely. A child who has been exploited may never recognise that exploitation as such, but it's really important that government and professionals who care for these children are equipped to identify this exploitation. That's why I have a key commitment in my strategic plan to ensure that there's clarity so that children can get the support that they need and deserve. It's shocking that children are still being exploited in communities across this country. And I think it's vital that we act now to make sure that we're giving them support. And it's unacceptable that the system is failing them because there's a lack of clarity about how exploitation is defined. That's why I've co-commissioned this work, More Than Words, with the fantastic MS PEC and ECPAT too. I think these findings show that confusion over definitions is leading to real harm and children falling through the gaps. And that's why I think this report is critical. It will help us ensure that child victims of exploitation are identified correctly and have access to the support they need wherever they live in the UK. I just wanted to draw on kind of three key reflections from the report and some of the findings before Laura goes into more detail. But I think this report shows that firstly, there's real inconsistency across the country and across the United Kingdom, depending on where children live. We found in this report that legal and operational definitions of child exploitation vary across the UK. That also means that there's also very narrow definitions of movement, and that obscures key indicators of exploitation such as recruitment, harbouring, and online exploitation. There shouldn't be a postcode lottery depending on where a child is that stops them being able to access the support and the identification of exploitation. Secondly, this report finds that stereotypes still persist in how people view child exploitation. It found that race, nationality, and gender continue to shape how exploitation is perceived and responded to. While child sexual exploitation and criminal exploitation are more often associated with UK nationals, this report found that modern slavery and trafficking is often seen as something that affects foreign national children. It's important that professionals understand that it's something that can affect UK nationals as well as facing foreign nationals too. Thirdly, I think a really important thing that comes out of this report is that it shows there's a fundamental misunderstanding about the unique and special needs of children, and they are too often being treated in the same way as adults. We see that there's confusion around consent and children having the means to consent to trafficking or exploitation. This is completely not the case. I think it's important across all these findings that whilst we are talking about technical issues, we recognise that actually they have a real impact on how children are experiencing the system and them escaping harm and exploitation. As this report makes clear, our fragmented language is failing some of the most vulnerable children in society. But hopefully, and a hopeful message to end on, is that this path ahead from this report is clear. This report sets out strong evidence that we need to push for a statutory definition of child exploitation. We need to include those with lived experience in the development of this terminology, and we need to ensure that there's a unified response to all systems and agencies who are in the National Referral Mechanism. As government reviews the National Referral Mechanism and through my border work, I will use the evidence from this report to push for that statutory guidance on child sexual exploitation and child criminal exploitation to ensure that no child is left unseen or unsupported. I want to thank again the researchers, those at MSPEC and ECPAT, for all the work that they've done on this report. I agree that it's completely comprehensive, and I think it's for all those children that are facing exploitation. I hope it means that we can do more to see them, hear them, and ultimately protect them. Thank you all for being here today, and I'm really pleased that I can now hand over to Laura, who's the co-author of this report, who's going to present the findings in more detail. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eleanor, for putting that so succinctly. And thank you all for joining us today for this launch. We are just absolutely delighted to be able to present this report, despite it, as Rose mentioned early on, being an absolute brick of a report. I have to apologize in advance to everybody for that. Please do check out the policy summary and the executive summary if you want a quick synopsis of what's going on. But I hope that the full report is also helpful, particularly for a lot of you who are working in the front line, because I think it can be a really good resource as a manual to go back to identify what the international legal standards and what the domestic legal standards are for different groups of children that you're coming across in a variety of situations. So with that said, I also wanted to start off by thanking our co-author, Leah, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, but put a massive amount of work into this research and into the drafting of this report. So I also wanted to flag her contribution, as well as the contribution of ECPAT UK's Youth Advisory Group, who provided so much insight into this report, and obviously the amazing art that you see in front of you from our brilliant Youth Advisory Group artist, TB. With that said, I want to jump really quickly into some of the first issues we identified in this report, which is the inconsistent definitions and how these are creating different silos, both operationally within local authorities, policing, as well as within central government. So when reviewing some of the National Referral Mechanism data, and that is the system that the UK uses to formally identify victims of modern slavery, that term refers to victims of slavery, servitude, forced or compulsory labor, as well as human trafficking as defined in the UK statutes. We found that for children who were refused in 2024, so for all of those that got a negative decision at both stages of the process, 61% of those refusals were as a result of not meeting the definition. So this definitional landscape is having a huge impact on whether children progress in that process to finally receive formal identification as a victim. And obviously that process is very important because within that system hinges a child's access to ECPAT entitlements. They receive these entitlements currently through local authority children's social care, yet the formal recognition will have a significant impact on whether we are able to continue to advocate for the child or not to receive specific ECPAT entitlements. And ECPAT refers to the European Convention on Action Against Trafficking in Human Beings. So that's at the referral stage. And additionally, another significant issue we identified with the definitions is that in all 4 UK jurisdictions that we looked into, England, Wales, Scotland, and the north of Ireland, we found that in most of those jurisdictions, the definition for child sexual exploitation and the non-statutory definition for child criminal exploitation included what is known within the human trafficking definition as the means. This is language that refers to how consent was obtained from a victim. And that is an irrelevant consideration when it comes to children, because it's been accepted that children can never consent to their own exploitation. So that type of language are words such as coercion, manipulation, deception, abuse of a position of vulnerability, all of which can very well be present in many children's cases. They're just not a legal standard that needs to be met for the child to be recognized as a victim. Meaning, even if a child knew entirely what was going to happen, wasn't manipulated, wasn't deceived, nobody coerced them, if they were recruited or transported or harbored or received for the purposes of exploitation, they are a victim of child trafficking. Yet these exploitation specific definitions bring in a higher bar than the child trafficking definition does. That's an issue because both of these definitions are referenced in the guidance that decision makers are using to formally identify child victims, and they're posing a significant barrier for these two exploitation types. But we also found that for other forms of exploitation that we examined in this research, such as labor exploitation and domestic servitude, frontline professionals still think that those are things that need to be met. I.e., the bar is slightly higher when it comes to children in the minds of professionals and how they're applying terminology, thinking that there needs to be physical force or that coercion or that deception in order for the case to qualify. So we have these issues both at the point of referral, in that the child may not be referred at all into the NRM, or at the point of formal identification, in that their case may be refused because those definitions in the guidance are contradicting each other. The second main issue we found is significant demographic bias And this is an issue, again, at the point of referral. So the way that the frontline professional applies the definition to the child in front of them, and at the point of identification. The first issue we find, which is very consistent throughout the literature, is that Black and ethnic minority children are frequently identified as perpetrators rather than victims. When children are being referred and are going through the formal procedure, there is significant disparity according to the child's nationality, with UK national children being refused in the NRM process at both stages at a rate of 7%, versus children from Iran, for example, who were refused at a rate of 59%, or Afghani children refused at a rate of 43%. Other nationalities of foreign national children also have really high refusal rates for not meeting the definition, such as Sudanese children at 35% and Albanian children at 30%. So that does signify a very significant bias within decision making based on the child's nationality for definitional purposes. The other issue we found around demographic bias is at the point of referral, in that because the legal terms, or generally the terminology around modern slavery and human trafficking, is often associated with foreign national children, many of the British national children, or even local children who may not necessarily have British nationality, but they may be born or raised in a particular area in the UK, are not being referred into the NRM because these terms are not associated with that particular demographic. Lastly, we found a significant issue across the board with regards to gender, with both girls and boys being slotted into particular exploitation types, mainly based on their gender. So girls are often associated with CSC and boys are often associated with child criminal exploitation. And that has significant impact in the under-identification of other forms of exploitation for either gender. Oh. Another significant issue, and this is an issue in England, Wales, and Northern Ireland, in that the human trafficking or modern slavery primary legislation in those jurisdictions legally defines human trafficking with a focus on travel. That's not really in line with the international definition, in that the Palermo Protocol does limit the application of that particular convention to transnational cases. But more importantly, the UNODC has clarified that that shouldn't be the case in the way that domestic jurisdictions interpret and apply this terminology, in that they should capture all forms of exploitation, not just those that have that cross-border emphasis. And additionally, the European Convention on Action Against Trafficking in Human Beings is very clear that that cross-border element is not necessarily the sole focus. Some cases may involve cross-border movement, some cases may involve movement internally, but movement should not be the only defining factor in that action element of the definition. You also have the other elements, such as recruitment or harboring, that need to be paid attention to. Yes, yet those terms are significantly irrelevant in those jurisdictions in the UK if they are not associated with that travel element, excluding a significant number of cases from being identified as human trafficking of both adults and children, but impacting significantly on children, especially in those types of cases of local children facing exploitation or children being exploited online where there is no movement at all. Additionally, the research did a very deep dive about how considerations of age will impact the interpretation of all these different definitions. Generally, for all exploitation types, we found that maturity is often interpreted as a proxy for consent, meaning that the older the child, even though they are still legally children under the age of 18, if, say, the child is now 16 or 17, they are more often seen as in a consensual situation. They are more perceived to have the agency to make those choices, and that then subsequently impacts their identification. As a result of this, one of the biggest issues we found is that it does tend to lead to significant criminalization of children, particularly for those who are exploited for criminality or children who are otherwise committing criminal offenses as a result of their exploitation. But obviously the impact on this is wide-ranging in that the child can be re-trafficked, go missing, not access support, because a lot of these things will hinge on the identification. We looked in detail into how these different age restrictions legally will impact the identification of children for different exploitation types. So we reviewed the impact that the age of sexual consent is having on the identification of children for human trafficking for the purposes of sexual exploitation, as well as the age of criminal responsibility and the legal age of work. And we found that all those three legal standards have a significant impact, particularly in that they lead to less consideration of victimhood for those older adolescents. And finally, we didn't start off reviewing this issue, but it was something that came up significantly throughout the empirical data across the interviews and workshops that we did, and is this new kind of silo that has emerged very specific to the UK. With the development of a lot of conceptual frameworks around extrafamilial harm that have taken place throughout the years, which rightly have brought a welcome emphasis on some of the wide range of harms that particularly adolescents face outside of the home. That has created, though, this silo in that exploitation and child trafficking is being always categorized within this extrafamilial framework in both official guidance, so statutory guidance from the Department for Education is something we cite in the report, as well as within child protection teams and within policing. So we had a lot of police officers say, well, if it's exploitation, that's extrafamilial. If it's within the family, that goes to the child abuse team. And there seems to be no recognition about all of these cases where the child may have been trafficked and exploited by members of the child's own family or other relatives within the home. This is the case potentially in a lot of domestic servitude cases, where those cases are being often interpreted as neglect, which may be an aspect of the abuse the child is suffering, yet that distinct aspect of child trafficking is not being identified. Additionally, in cases of child labor exploitation, for example, when it's occurring within a family business or by family members, that significantly complicated the identification of children, as well as all child criminal exploitation being categorized as extrafamilial was significantly challenged, particularly by all our colleagues in the north of Ireland, who stated, well, that's mainly not the case here. A lot of these children are being exploited for criminality by paramilitary linked relatives. So that's, that kind of binary does not make sense at all. Just to wrap up all of these themes, as we come to the end of this presentation, I wanted to highlight some of the recommendations that we're making to the government. One of the biggest things I suppose that came across in this research is that the one kind of term that a lot of people coalesce on when we're talking about all these issues, modern slavery, human trafficking, etc., plus all the exploitation types, is child exploitation. Yet child exploitation is not legally defined either internationally or domestically. And most professionals we interviewed felt that a definition of child exploitation is very important, yet a lot of them disagree about how broad or how elastic that definition should be. We do call on the government to introduce that definition and to pair that with a child exploitation strategy that can look at all these forms of abuse holistically, so that we stop putting these children into the various categories and silos, given that children are often poly-victimized in so many different forms of abuse, and we prevent these kind of artificial binaries that are hindering the identification in a lot of these cases. I suppose that's one of the main things we wish policymakers to take into account, and our CEO Patricia is going to talk a little bit more about why that's so essential and important from ECPAT UK's perspective. We also call on the government to review their decision-making process, particularly to understand why there is such a disparity between nationality types, and to ensure that all the definitions for formal victim identification are in line with international law, in that we don't have this focus on travel, and additionally we don't add the additional consideration of the means element for children's cases for any form of exploitation, or that we don't differentiate children who are exploited either by family members or by people outside of the family as an artificial binary. Thank you so much, and looking forward to answering your questions later on.
Thank you so much, Laura. I know how difficult that was, putting everything in 15 minutes, but you did such a wonderful job. It was only that last minute that I had to give in the signal. So thank you so, so much. I now open it to the floor for questions are coming in. So just before we collate the questions, I did want to maybe start kicking it off with, where do you see future research in this area continuing? That there's such a wealth of information. Where would you start?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Rose. And I think somebody already asked if the research included children in forced early marriage. Originally, that's something that the initial idea for this research had. This was an idea by my predecessor, Chloe Setter, who brilliantly also came up with the title for this project. And it was a much wider scope, looking at a lot of different forms of exploitation, such as early child marriage, illegal adoption, child soldiers, a lot of sort of adjacent forms of exploitation. I would have loved to have a look at, for example, child influencers. But unfortunately, because of the time frame for this project, we had to really limit it. And even then, it's a brick of a report and an absolute monster. But yes, absolutely, there is so much scope to investigate those other adjacent terms. And we do have recommendations for research within the report that, for those of you who are doing research, should check out as gaps that we have identified that do need additional research into.
Amazing, thank you. There's a question in the chat. There is now a move across our region to renaming CE to harm outside the home. As we know, this is generally the case, but not when exploitation originates from the home as described previously. What thoughts do you have about this renaming? Is this helpful or steering us away from what is really happening?
Yes, that's a good question. I mean, like I said at the start, some of the drive for this focus on extrafamilial harm has been helpful for child victims of trafficking, many who may be exploited extrafamilially. We don't really have data on the perpetrator relationship to children in the main. And I think what has been of greater benefit is the focus on adolescents, because we do know that most child trafficking victims are within that 15 to 17 age range in the main. I think our latest figures in this report show that it was like 88% of referrals in 2024. Sorry if that figure is wrong, but it's in the 80s. So that has been a benefit. But I think that when you set up teams specifically in that way, you come into the complexity that what about these cases where the child's being trafficked, exploited generally by family members? They're falling through the gaps. People don't know how to deal with these cases because it's not necessarily the expertise of your more traditional child abuse team, but again, if the focus is internally extrafamilially, then those expertise won't be there either because of the familial relationship. There's other considerations to be had there. So I'm not sure that those distinctions are helpful necessarily within child protection or within central government through guidance in teams and departments.
So complicated, isn't it? We have a great question from Dr. Anna Skills. Practitioners and professionals in our research on outcomes for the ICTIC service also raised issues around definitions and how language matters, as well as how the forms and processes, for example, in the NRM, does not facilitate a more complex picture of child exploitation or enable more complex identification and referral. Did the research reveal recommendations regarding how these forms, processes, or systems might be revised?
Yes, thanks so much for that question, Anna. A lot of practitioners mentioned how frustrating it is to be able to slot children or fit children into these narrow boxes. Many professionals rely on indicators in the main. So fitting, for example, a particular child's case into, say, the NRM referral form or these other child protection procedures felt very frustrating, often like a tick box. I don't remember. I think we do have a recommendation about that. There are so many recommendations, I think about 50 or more. So I will need to go back, but off the top of my head, I believe we do have something around that for professionals in general.
Brilliant. One question came in. Do you think that the creation of multidisciplinary specialist teams would help victims and ensure a better service for them?
Yes, Jeff, I think that would be a good idea, especially, teams that do have that level of training to respond to the myriad and the differences within all these cases and all these forms of exploitation. But yes, I think that absolutely would be a good idea.
Great. There is one question. They paraphrased it by saying that it's a basic question. It's not at all. Where do you get the statistics for NRM referrals by UK region? I thought maybe there could also be a chance to describe how the statistics were used from the NRM database.
Yes, absolutely. So, Grant, there's basically two places where you can access those statistics. One are the official statistics. If you just Google NRM statistics, it gives you all the quarterly and the end of year reports, and those can be really helpful for an initial kind of scoping. You will have that breakdown within those by each UK region. If you want to get a little bit more detailed, like this research did in, for example, the differences in age breakdown or the reasons for the refusals at the different stages, you'd have to request access through the UK data service. So if you just Google UK data service, you can request access to the raw NRM data, and that will give you a really large data set that you can kind of review through different disaggregation forms for the specific things that you're researching. But that process takes a little while. You do need to get permission from the data holder, et cetera, for a specific project in order to do that. Oh, and the way that the data was used. Sorry. So we did a scope of the raw data for predominantly a very intricate look at the 2024 data for both the demographic disparities across nationality types for refusals for not meeting the definition. We also looked at whether there was any disparities around the child's exploitation type for not meeting the definition. Those were interesting findings in that criminal exploitation, which is actually the most identified form of exploitation of children in the UK, had the lowest rate of refusal for not meeting the definition, and domestic servitude had the highest. I think it was about 30% versus a much lower rate for criminal exploitation. And we also looked at the data for whether there was a significance in definitional refusal rates depending on who referred the child into the NRM, if it was a local authority, if it was a police force, or if it was a government agency. So one of the Home Office agencies or the National Crime Agency. And we found that it did the group that had the highest refusal rate for not meeting the definition were the government agencies.
Brilliant, thank you. That's brilliant. In your experience, do you find it worthy to comprehensively develop and digitize national, subnational level databases, anonymized and accessible only to frontliners, to improve re-victimization and provide reintegration support?
I'm rereading your question just because I want to make sure that I understand exactly. I mean, I think that the anonymized data has been really helpful for us, particularly in this project, in order to be able to identify trends that we didn't know about before at all, like those disparities in nationality types or those differences around different types of exploitation and the way that they're meeting or not meeting the definition. I'm not sure I understand what you mean with regards to improving re-victimization, because the data is anonymized. If I get this straight, I don't think there's a risk of that because there's no way to identify that particular case, and it's very high level data. You don't have any details of the case or anything like that. It's different information fields like the child's nationality, the year they were referred, the year their or the quarter their decision was made, the status of that decision, if they were exploited in the UK or abroad, what the basis of the negative decision was at either stage, who referred them. It's those sorts of things and not at all the details of what they went through of their abuse. I hope that answers your question, but obviously feel free to type in if I didn't.
Yes, and also if you would like to ask it verbally, please do feel free to put your hand up and we can come to you to discuss. The next question I have on my list are there plans to get trafficking within the UK more widely discussed or legislated for? This might not be specific to the project, but in your views, where are we now in the policy landscape from what you've managed to get from this research, and how do you think it's shifting?
Well, there are plans underway at the moment to review the modern slavery definitions brought large for adults and children. Sorry, writ large for adults and children. So that's work that was announced, I think a week or 2 weeks ago by the Home Office. Whether they will bring in more legislation, I don't know. That has been mentioned as something that there is maybe an intention to do, but there is no firm commitment to do at the moment. So I think it's more of a let's wait and see type of thing.
Brilliant answer. The I find this one really interesting. So from Phoebe Bond, what are your thoughts on the pilot for devolved NRM decision making? Your recommendations suggest including an independent review mechanism to scrutinize NRM decision making, but does your research speak to any differences in NRM outcomes for children who are being reviewed in a local-led multi-agency NRM panel?
The findings do speak of that because a lot of the participants who we interviewed or who attended the workshops are part or chair the devolved decision-making panels. And a lot of them actually express frustration between the decision the panel makes and then the kind of pushback that they're getting from the Home Office with regards to that particular definition, often overturning it or coming to a different conclusion. So there's a few quotes in the report that you can see that are talking about those issues. We didn't get a lot into the recommendations for that process in general, because it's not rolled out. We don't really have the data, the comparison in the raw data to see if it's having a significant impact on definitional refusals or not. So we made them more general around the process. But obviously, our long-standing recommendation is to roll out the devolved decision making for all children. And I think with that rollout, we should really be thinking about a review into the way that those decisions are being finalized or pushed back from by the Home Office because of the expertise that are held within the multi-agency partners that are making those decisions at the moment. I think are often in conflict and presenting an issue. So, but they're working so well, and obviously they have been shown to improve outcomes for children so much, especially with regards to the time the decision takes and the level of expertise that can be involved and the level of information and detail available to decision makers. It's just a really high quality. So we're all also really grateful to the Home Office staff that participate in that project for all of the support that they gave us in attending our workshop and providing support to on their views for this research.
Thank you so much, Laura. Just a reminder that I saw some people put their hands up, but then put them down. If you put them up now, I'll make sure that we come to you. There's a more conceptual question from Kath Armstrong, who's representing the NHS here. Do you feel that the NHS reforms and significant cuts in funding will have an adverse impact on child victims? And they've included that the NHS 10-year plan does not lend itself easily to victims of MSHT. And they're interested in your views on health and responses to victims of modern slavery and human trafficking.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, Kath. That's not something we looked at in this research, and I have to say I'm very ignorant about health policy far and wide. My focus is so narrow into this policy, but just sort of my general instinct is to say that generally cuts to sort of wider services such as cuts to children's social care or cuts within other areas always impact this group of children because they are so vulnerable and so in need of resources. We already have a bit of a crisis with even these children being able to access mental health support through CAMS, the thresholds being so high, so much gatekeeping to access those services. So I feel pretty confident saying that any of these cuts are likely going to affect this group of children, but obviously that's not something this research looked into or something I have evidence to support.
Thank you. I'm conscious of time, and we've got some really great questions coming in. Maybe I can take two more. So, given the report's findings on the definitional inconsistencies across UK jurisdictions and the lack of a child-specific legal standard, how can policymakers ensure a unified child-centered approach to identifying and responding to exploitation, especially when current frameworks continue to conflate age, consent, and nationality in ways that obscure victimhood?
Well, obviously, we would urge them to consider our recommendations to be able to solve these issues. Predominantly, our recommendation to introduce a child exploitation definition that is produced in collaboration with children and young people themselves, as well as other stakeholders, and that is precise enough to ensure that we are capturing these cases, but also has enough elasticity to account for all the emerging forms of exploitation that we can't even imagine now. Beyond that, I think it's really challenging to see how we can fix this definitional landscape, because it really is, as the report sets out, all over the place, and a lot of children are falling through the cracks.
Thank you so much, Laura. I'm so sorry. I did say we'd do 2 more, but I'm conscious of time, and it's on people's lunch breaks, and I want enough people to be here to hear from Patricia. So I will end the Q&A session here. Please do feel free to send questions via email. I can speak for Laura confidently that she's always welcoming to questions about the research. But I will happily hand it over to Patricia Durr, the CEO of ECPAT UK, to give some closing remarks. Patricia, over to you.
Thanks so much to everyone involved, and not least, I have to give a big shout out to our Laura Duran. I think it's an amazing piece of work, and yeah, without the support of Emma's Peck and the Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner, and also Freshfields doing some pro bono work for us, there's no way we could have done this research. So I am really grateful. It's been, as Laura mentioned, it's been in our hearts and minds to do this for a number of years now, and we're a very small charity, and we know that collaboration is the only way to achieve anything. So thank you, and thanks to everyone for your attention today. I guess the main message I just wanted to end on is that whatever words we use, child exploitation, child trafficking, modern slavery, it's all child abuse. And the report shows the confusion in the system and the gaps between which children are falling, and the fact that much of this abuse does not trigger a child protection response. As the report title indicated, it is about more than words. It means that child victims are not identified, they're not protected or supported. Different children are treated differently and are subject to discrimination. The focus on one form of exploitation over another and at a time leads to siloed approaches, and we don't really understand the full extent of the harms done to children, and we certainly don't sufficiently protect them. With an age of criminal responsibility set at 10, many children end up being criminalised for their own exploitation. We're so grateful to the many experts involved in this research, practitioners, academics, professionals, and children and young people. They shared their insights and knowledge so generously, and it's a real example of working together at its best. It feels also very timely. It's clear from everyone we spoke to that the systems that are meant to protect children are failing, but more hopefully that there are things that can be done to change. Overall, the message is the need for clarity in the system and investment in children. We need a UK-wide cross-governmental strategy that Laura has spoken about, and we need more working together with a focus on children as children. There are some opportunities to achieve this. Laura mentioned the Home Office is currently consulting on the identification of victims and the National Referral Mechanism. As part of that, definitions of modern slavery are being reviewed. There's a drive in the Modern Slavery Action Plan to develop a new strategy, and the call for a specific child exploitation strategy is being heard. There is a commitment to set out the definition of child criminal exploitation for the new offence created in the Crime and Policing Bill in statutory guidance. There will be a public inquiry into child sexual exploitation by organised groups in response to the recommendations of the Casey review. And the investment in children's social care announced in the spending review and the positive measures announced in the Children's Wellbeing and Schools Bill are welcome. However, until we start respecting the rights of all children, investing in the services and provision to support their development, and behaving as advocates for them, we'll not reach the ultimate goal of preventing such abuse happening in the first place. And we'll continue to wait until they are adult survivors to be held accountable to them, as the case review so powerfully demonstrates. What this report shows is that we are accountable now, and we can and must do more. Thank you so much for your interest, and do contact us for any further discussion or questions.
Thank you so much, Patricia. So beautifully said, as always. Thank you. And a huge thank you to all our speakers, and particularly the work that Laura and Leah have put into this piece of research. It was an absolute honour to work with you and to just see how beautifully you encompassed everything in such a short amount of time. And it's all so worth it in the end. And again, a huge thank you for the turnout and for the interest in this piece of research. It's incredibly important, and we hope to continue sharing such amazing work with all of you very soon. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.